All right. Hello, friends. Welcome to our fireside chat tonight. My name is Shahan Dada. I'm one of the deputy All on the Line campaign directors with All on the Line. We are an organization that seeks to fight redistricting, or sorry, wow, fight gerrymandering to make sure that maps are fair in the 2021-2022 redistricting cycle. We ask folks to get involved at the local level, talk to their state legislators, testify at public hearings for their commissions, and generally speak up and have their voices heard. I'm joined today by Gabby Goldstein. Gabby, if you want to introduce yourself in Sister District, that'd be great.
Sure. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Gabby Goldstein. I'm one of our co-founders at Sister District, and I'm our political director at our PAC, where we work to elect progressive state legislators, as well as director of research at our 501c4, where we have a civic engagement program, which includes our book club. So it is wonderful to be with everyone, and I'm so excited for this conversation with two of my favorite people.
Great. I am excited too. And I'm excited to chat again with Dave. So for folks who missed our chit chat before we got started, Gabby was noticing that her fireside chat with Dave Daley for RAT-Effed, because I'm not apparently allowed to say the full word, because sometimes kids are listening, was 2 years ago. And then Dave and I had our first fireside chat with All on the Line last August. But today we're not going to be talking about RAT-Effed, the book. We probably will talk about it a little bit as an issue that we get into with Dave, who his new book, which is what we're discussing today, Unrigged, came out just a couple months ago. So for folks who don't know Dave, he's got a great Twitter following, so check him out there because he talks a lot about redistricting and voting rights. But he is also a senior fellow at Fair Vote, and is a former editor-in-chief of Salon. And Dave, I know it says that you live in Massachusetts. As a Californian, I'll let you have that one, but you know, West Coast, best coast. Folks who are asking what Dave's Twitter handle is, it's at Dave Daley 3. Don't ask me why I know that, probably because I just tweeted at it a little bit ago. So Dave, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Shahan and Gabby. I'm very grateful to be here, and so admire all of the work both of your organizations do, and that all of these amazing people on the line are doing. So thank you for having me.
Thanks. Well, Dave, if you're ready to talk about Unrigged, we're ready to chat about Unrigged as well.
Let's go.
Okay, so we are in, like, we've been saying this for a while, the most unprecedented election cycle of our generation. I feel like every conference call I'm on is like the most unprecedented election year ever. But so Unrigged makes a point about so much action for voting and redistricting happening below the national level. Everyone's talking about the Trump-Biden election, but I want to dig in. What are some important venues where voting rights and redistricting work actually happens that's not way up here?
It's a great question. We are thinking about the White House. We're thinking about the Senate, and some of the most important elections this fall are going to be way down ballot at the state legislative level, because the lines are at stake again. This is a census year, it's a redistricting year. It means that the state legislatures that are elected this fall are going to be the ones who draw the maps on which all of our political fights for the next decade are fought, assuming that this president loses and actually leaves the White House. The next president will serve a 4-year term, and then we'll have another election in November of 2024. But these maps are going to be in place until 2031. And as we have learned over the course of this decade, they are extremely important, and they can do an awful lot to entrench an enduring minority rule. There are 59 million Americans right now who live in a state in which one or both chambers of the state legislature is controlled by the party that won fewer votes in the 2018 election. It may not surprise many of you that all 59 million of those people live in a state in which Democratic candidates won more votes, and Republicans hold all of the power in the legislature. And this is not to make a partisan point, except to say that this is an extraordinarily dangerous situation for the concept of representative democracy. It means that politicians are insulated from the people. It means it's hard for a majority of voters to hold politicians accountable and turn them out when they want a direction. It pushes our politics towards the extreme. It pours, gasoline on polarization, and it leads to policies that people don't want. That voters have an increasingly difficult time doing anything about. So it's a super serious problem, and if we want to beat it, and if we want to have a different kind of maps for the next decade, it is all on the line right now.
Hashtag all on the line. I love it. The branding, it writes itself. No, I mean, that's amazing. Thank you, Dave. And I mean, it's probably no surprise. I was so, delighted is the wrong word because it's all horrible, but amazed by the incredible collection of examples in Unrigged about how state legislatures have been this gatekeeper of voting rights, especially conservatively controlled legislatures. I mean, the Alabama legislature reinstating moral turpitude after a court, federal court held it was purposeful racial discrimination, felony disenfranchisement, black codes, going back to the black codes as creatures of state law, voter ID laws, all of the different ways. I'm curious, what you learned in this process of your research and talking to folks about the ways that state legislatures have been this gatekeeper, and if that's, something that we need to keep in mind this year as we go to the polls.
It's a big question and a great question. I mean, you can see it around the country right now, right? I mean, in Georgia this week, after an election melted down a couple of weeks ago, Georgia's state legislature has barred, or is attempting to bar, that can, if it wants to, they hold a veto-proof majorities there, the Secretary of State from sending every citizen and registered voter a ballot, not a ballot, a ballot application for a vote by mail to get this process started. You are seeing Tennessee move to make it more difficult to register to vote during a pandemic. You are seeing Iowa and Ohio bar their secretaries of state from paying postage on these applications or these mail-in ballots. You're seeing the state of Texas say, sure, it's okay to use COVID as an excuse to vote absentee here if you are over the age of 65, which means if you are more likely to be a conservative Republican voter. There are lots and lots of things that states can do to make it easier to vote or to make it harder to vote. And as we move towards the most unprecedented election of our lifetime, which is going to be a really, we see right now, people talk sometimes, if the pandemic comes back in the fall, along with the flu and a presidential election, the pandemic never went away. The pandemic is still here. We are going to be attempting to have a presidential election during a pandemic. We're going to have this combination of vote by mail and vote in person. States aren't doing a particularly good job at either aspect right now. It's really hard to do. It's hard to set up vote by mail and flick a switch and make it happen. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of money, and these are extraordinarily difficult circumstances that election administrators are working under. But the difficulties are exacerbated by these state legislatures that are making it so much harder to do the really simple things that have to be done to make sure that people can vote this fall, and that they can vote without having to make this horrible choice between their civic voice and their health and the health of their loved ones.
Totally. And one follow-up on that, there's a great line in Unrigged where you're talking to Norm Ornstein, and he says that the next generation of state legislators will, quote, make today's Freedom Caucus look agreeable by comparison. And I was reminded of Alexander Hurdle Fernandez's relatively new book, which if you guys had any idea how dog-eared I made this book, like literally went through and did, this is sorry to pitch another book while we're on the line.
It's a great book. I encourage everyone to pick that up.
Great book, but what he makes the point that with data from his dissertation that state legislators are way more conservative than their voters and the people that they represent. And he's got some really great data around that. But it seems as though these state legislators, the conservative ones, are just becoming much even more conservative over time, which I would argue is a good reason to try to get them out this year. They're not going in the right direction in terms of the voters that they represent.
They will entrench themselves for another decade if we don't get them out this year. And there are parts of this country, and Unrigged is an optimistic book. I'm not sounding optimistic right now. I've got to turn my tone around here. But there are parts of this country that are turning into what I sometimes call a democracy desert, where voting rights are drying up, where the state legislature is increasingly placing barriers between citizens and the ballot box. And this is part of a project. It's part of a project that goes back years. It's part of a project that is what happens when a party understands that its base is shrinking, and they decide to make it more difficult for the other side to vote rather than try to address everybody in a beautiful and diverse democracy. And that is what's happening.
Totally.
I'm thinking about like this beautiful and diverse democracy, Jay, that you just talked about. And like, that's always the dream, right? Like, yeah. But I'm trying to find like the optimism. But like, I was looking at my Twitter and my Instagram before we hopped on, and I saw so many friends who had reshared that picture of voters in Kentucky banging on the door of their polling place. And I mean, like the one thing that I was stuck with was their solutions in that moment were to either bang on the door or pray that there was a judge who said like, yes, we'll open voting back up. And the voting period that they opened it back up for was 30 minutes, which to me, I don't know how you get hundreds and hundreds of people to vote in 30 minutes. Also, the adage of stay in line, you get to vote, seems to ring true. But thinking about this beautiful, diverse democracy that we hope to someday see, what can communities do? Like your Secretary of State's non-responsive, your election administrator countywide or locality-wide is non-responsive, and then you're seeing poll closures, you're seeing broken machines and underfunded voting administrations. What can everyone do, like, to get that to work?
That's a great question. I mean, let me start here. We need to fully fund all of these efforts, and we as citizens need to be pushing our representatives to be fully funding this fall's elections. The Brennan Center has said it's going to cost $4 billion to put on, to do the kind of vote by mail transition that we need. And that is a rounding error for democracy in the middle of the trillions of dollars that have been put forth to save Wall Street and the economy and big corporations. This is what it will take if we want to be certain that the absentee ballots that people request actually get to them. If we want to ensure that states have the funding to hire poll workers so that entire counties like Jefferson County, 54 miles wide, have more than one in-person voting location, that we have the optical scanners and the staff that is trained to count votes, so it doesn't take a week to know who wins a state like Pennsylvania and Michigan. We need to be pushing our state legislatures to be, the gold standard of this is going to be sending a ballot to everybody automatically without having to go through hoops and request it and request an application and then mail in the application and then wait for the ballot and send the ballot back. That could be a 5-week-long process. So if you are voting by mail, start the second you are able to apply, because this is not going to be a simple or a couple day long process. So there's a lot of things that we can do on the political side. What I tried to do in this book really was tell the story of individuals and organizations that came together and stood up against what seemed like they were huge structural barriers that were too big to be pushed down, that in fact had been so big that other people, oftentimes more powerful people, had said, that can't be torn down, so I'm not even going to try. And whether these were people who took on felon voting rights in Florida, which had been an issue for 135 years, whether these were people who took on a redistricting in states so hopelessly gerrymandered that people just threw up their hands and thought the entire decade was going to be lost, whether these were Native Americans in Utah and North Dakota who had simply been so specifically targeted, but by voter ID and other really horrible forms of voter suppression, that they stood up, made their own IDs, fought back and won. Whether these were folks in Idaho, in a bright red state that you can actually count the number of Democrats in, in most years, you can use one hand to count the number of Democrats in the state legislature in Idaho. And they expanded Medicaid there. They expanded Obamacare for 70,000 of their neighbors. They would not take no for an answer. They did not believe that any of these fights were too difficult or beyond the ability of normal people to stand up and take on and win in red states, in purple states, all around the nation. So as we look at the challenges of this fall of an election and all of this, we can talk about how difficult it's going to be, and we can be aware of all of the various forms of suppression, and they're coming. They will be here. You can see the roadmap. You can see them doing dress rehearsals in Georgia, in Wisconsin, in a lot of places. But we can also take hope and faith and courage from what has been done over the last couple of years, the victories that have been won when people have stood up and fought back and said, no, that is not the country I want to live in. This is the country I want to live in.
That's so true. I mean, like, Dave, you just talked about like the Native American story, and I think that was the chapter that I actually stopped and read twice because there was so much hope and optimism. I mean, for me, I read the book 2 or 3 weeks ago when we were at the height of protests in response to the murder of George Floyd, and that's like a microcosm of what the actual problem is. I mean, we're talking about systemic racism in this country. And you can see the tie between systemic racism and voting rights. They're so interlinked. And like you talk about it in the chapter about Native Americans fighting back for their right to vote. And then now we're seeing these uprisings in the streets following George Floyd's murder and the fight and the movement for Black lives. And I'm thinking about like how there's a call for, electing a DA that's actually responsive to the community. There's a call for saying, how can we elect mayors who listen to their constituencies? But like, what levers of power do we actually have to fight systemic racism when it comes to voting rights and voting systems?
All of these down ballot races matter so much. DA races, mayors, state legislatures, county officials, all of it matters and all of it helps. Secretaries of state offices, Republicans have targeted secretaries of state offices, attorney general's offices for decades, and the same concerted efforts and prioritization needs to happen on the other side. I would say this, these are laws that make it so, systemic racism in the voting rights world in some ways is grounded in law. Why do the polls close in Kentucky at 6 o'clock? I mean, who were those people who were banging on the doors trying to get in? They were people who had to work all day, probably in jobs that, unlike mine, don't have the flexibility to get up in the middle of the day and take an hour on a shuttle bus up to the one polling place and then wait in line for a period of time that you don't know how long it's going to take, and then take that shuttle back and get back to work, who maybe can't take 3.5 hours off at the end of the day, and then they say, after 5 o'clock I'm going to go and vote, and they've got an hour to get over there, and when there's a traffic jam in the parking lot, they find themselves banging on the door. It starts with a horrible rule passed by a white legislature, right, that says we're going to stop voting at 6 o'clock. All of these voting rules and systems have been put in place, and most of them are there to guard the power of those who put them there. And the courts have not been our friend on this in the last decade. I know Attorney General Holder's doing an event tomorrow night talking about Shelby County. I think that there's a real combination here of what happened with gerrymandering in 2010 as Republicans focused on state legislatures, and then what happened in 2013 when the Supreme Court, in that horrific 5-4 decision, essentially says that racism is over. It's not 1965 anymore. It's 2013, and Alabama is a completely changed place. And so they gutted the Section 5 enforcement mechanism of the Voting Rights Act. They ended preclearance, which had done so much to make all of these states different. Justice Ginsburg, in her dissent, said that getting rid of preclearance was like throwing away your umbrella because it was raining, but you were dry, and what you saw after Shelby County was, voter ID laws in 24 new states. What you saw was, 33 million Americans purged from voting rolls between 2014 and 2018. What you saw is the closure of precincts, thousands of them across the South in states that would have necessitated the approval of the Justice Department in the past to be able to do that. And those states included Georgia, right? And what you see is that these states don't do this in a way that, makes, they like to say, we've closed these precincts because more people are voting by mail, or because they're not compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Except the end result of all of this is always to disproportionately burden voting rights of communities of color, of Black people, of young people, systematically across the board, whether it's these poll closures, whether it's the elimination of days of early voting, whether it's the specific requirements of voter ID bills. All of it is systematic tools of oppression and racism.
1000%. I mean, so essentially what you're saying, and you make this case so well in the book, is that so many voting laws are indelibly tied to systemic racism. I mean, going back, you know, you talk about the Black codes changing the laws on vagrancy and petty theft to be felonies, specifically so that Black people would not be able to vote. You talk about, you know, after the Civil War, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, you know, Mississippi, all instituting felony disenfranchisement, Texas, Tennessee, North Carolina. And, you know, you know, we talked about the moral turpitude before. This is embedded. The connection between voting and racism is embedded in the very fabric of our state laws going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And so we're fighting this fight that has such incredibly large racial justice implications when we're talking about voting rights.
The story of felon voting rights in this country is so horrifying. Because you're absolutely right. It is so tied together with those days after the Civil War and with white efforts to maintain power across the South. And when you go back and research this, the things you learn versus the things that we're taught, you know, it's yet another example, right? So all of these southern states that had seceded from the Union, they had to agree to adopt the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They had to ratify all of these, essentially our equal protection amendments as a precondition to coming back into the Union. They didn't want to do this. In Florida, by ratifying the 14th Amendment and guaranteeing the right of Black voters, of Black citizens to vote, whites would have been in the minority in Florida in the 1860s. They were not interested in that. So what they did instead was, on one hand, they told the federal government, okay, we will ratify these amendments. And then they wrote brand new state constitutions. And when you go back and read the actual deliberations, they are talking directly about white supremacy. And that is what they are writing into their state constitutions in the 1860s, in the 1870s, in so many of these southern states, in Alabama, in Florida, across you know, much of that territory. They said, okay, if you commit a felony, you will lose your right to vote. And then we're going to redefine what a felony is to include all of the things that a poor Black person in 1870s Alabama might be forced into doing, like stealing an orange or, you know, looking the wrong way at a white person. You know, and these are the Black codes, and this is the, you know, birth of Jim Crow. And this structural racism is literally written, it's baked into the cake of all of these constitutions across the South. And I mean, one of my favorite stories in the book comes from Alabama, and I joined some amazing organizers in Alabama from the Campaign Legal Center and the Southern Poverty Law Center, who were determined to, so Alabama has moral turpitude. Moral turpitude says that, I'm trying to explain this quickly and I'm all over the place. So Alabama essentially says, if we determine that a felony includes what they vaguely call moral turpitude, that's going to cost you your right to vote. And then they define moral turpitude as as laws that research shows them that blacks are more likely to commit than whites. So when the Speaker of the House embezzles, and there's a bribery scandal, that is not moral turpitude, but a minor drug charge is moral turpitude. And this is really vague. Over the years, the courts say you can't do this. The state essentially ignores the court and keeps it there. There's the threat of legal action in the middle of last decade, and they finally, 2016-ish, strike it down. But the state does nothing to help the 75,000 people who were given back their voting rights know that they can vote again. And that's really important, right? I mean, Crystal Mason in Texas is in jail for accidentally voting as a former felon, even when a judge told her it was okay that she could, and the judge was wrong. So it's understandable that the people might not want to take that risk. The state would do nothing to help. These groups said, we're going to go out and find people and register them door to door. And I joined them in Birmingham on this hot day in August, and we're walking up to people at the bus station, and you don't want to walk up to people and say, do you have a felony in your past and can't vote? So you say, we're out this morning talking to people about a change in the law. We want to let you know in case it affects somebody. You know, if you're a former, if you have a felony conviction in your past, you can get your right to vote back. And this woman of color, late 30s, on her way to work on the bus, kind of gets interested. And she says, no, you know, I can't vote. I have a felony conviction. It turns out she had a marijuana possession from when she was 17 years old. So do the math on this, right? She had never voted in her life. She lost her voting rights forever because of a marijuana possession charge at the age of 17. And she thought she would never, ever get them back again. She got caught up, right? She got ensnared in these black codes from the 1870s. That embedded structural racism ensnared this woman and took away her voting rights for 20 years, possibly forever, because of the kind of structural racism that was embedded in Alabama's Constitution in 1870, still with us to this day.
Totally. And I mean, one of my I say favorite, this is not fair, I don't mean that in like a positive way. I mean, one of the most amazing things to me is, does anyone on this call know when Mississippi ratified the 13th Amendment? 1995. And wait for it, there was a clerical error whereby that ratification was never certified until 2013. 2013, Mississippi ratified the 13th Amendment. So like it certified that ratification, which had not happened until 1995. So, I mean, this is what we're talking about when we talk about this is baked into state law, this systemic racism, it's baked into the very fabric, and it's very hard to dislodge, right? And so what we're talking about here in terms of breaking through, building people power to find ways to break through these deeply embedded systems that have been tools of oppression. State legislatures have used state law as tools of racial and gender oppression and all the rest for literally for hundreds of years. And so it's totally wild and crazy, but here we are fighting, as you say, you know, and you make the case in the book. And so, you know, I just wanted to mention, you talked a little bit about Supreme Court cases before, and, you know, Shahen and I are lawyers, so, but, you know, it's fascinating to me. I feel really strongly, I'm so curious for your thoughts, Dave, that, you know, states and state courts are becoming more and more important because the Supreme Court, the federal Supreme Court, now has, you know, is stacked with folks who have dedicated their professional lives to a vision of states' rights and a devolution of federal power back to states. And we're stuck with this now for the next generation, regardless, regardless of what happens in the next election. We have this composition of the Supreme Court. We look at the ACA, you mentioned in your book, the ACA Supreme Court decision allowing states to decide whether to expand Medicaid, kicking that decision to states. We have the Voting Rights Act being gutted by the Supreme Court, kicking voting rights back to states. We have the Supreme Court decisions that partisan gerrymandering is unjusticiable at the federal level, kicking the issue back to states and state Supreme Courts. And so I'm curious for your perspective on what, this to me seems like a permanent shift for the Supreme Court in devolving power back to states, making this project that we're all engaged in of building democratic power in the states even more important, because the Supreme Court ain't coming back anytime soon on this.
The Supreme Court is not the friend of voting rights. I would say the Chief Justice has done significant, perhaps even permanent damage to the health of our democracy. I mean, right, in his own self-image, he's this learned umpire. He's like, hey, I'm just calling balls and strikes, right? But in his actual job, what he is the enforcement muscle for a voting rights wrecking crew. And he's providing the legal and ideological, a technical backup that allows a minority of voters in states to hold increasingly unfettered power. And, I do worry that it's the dismal future of voting rights with this federal bench that's been created by Trump and McConnell. But it's also, the really maddening, present day of voting rights as Roberts leads this ill-gained conservative majority that again and again, it delivers on Republican political aims while undermining fair and equal access to the ballot for the Republicans' political opponents. And that is a real fundamental problem. It's going to make states all the more important. But that's complicated, right? Because of the nature of population and geography and where people live. And the trouble is it turns something like voting rights into the democracy deserts we were talking about earlier, that it becomes easier to vote if you live in Oregon than if you live in Alabama. You shouldn't have different access to your most important right based on where you live. And that's what we are headed towards. The flip side of this, the optimism and the hope comes in that state Supreme Courts often have, and state constitutions often have more fundamental protections of voting rights than the federal Constitution, which really, it doesn't protect the right to vote at all. And what we've seen in Pennsylvania and North Carolina are maps that have been tossed as unconstitutional by state Supreme Courts as violations of free and fair election clauses in state constitutions. So we can hope that that is a road forward, and it may be in some places, right? In Alabama, that's not going to help you. In North Carolina, it might. You begin to see the importance of these of states Supreme Court elections, right? In what happened in Wisconsin back in April. The reason why Republicans were so determined to force voters to the polls in person in the middle of a pandemic was not because they really wanted Democratic voters to have their say on the Biden versus Sanders primary, but because there was a state Supreme Court judgeship on the ballot that day, and they thought that it would be easier for turnout if folks in rural and suburban areas where it was easier to social distance had to vote, and that they would have an advantage in this race because they were only able to open 5 of 180 precincts in Milwaukee, and this would make it easier for the Republican Supreme Court justice to win. They forced the gerrymandered Republican state legislature sued to force voters to the polls. The Republican majority on the state Supreme Court upheld this, and the Republican majority on the US Supreme Court, 4 of the 5 of those justices appointed by presidents that lost the popular vote, made it that your vote had to be in and postmarked on a very specific day. So state Supreme Courts add that to the list of things we need to be working on. Added to the list of elections Sister District is taking on, as if you need more.
I mean, I'm going to turn it over to Shen, but I just have to mention one of my very favorite things in this book is when you mentioned, speaking of state Supreme Courts, when Anita Earls was running for the state Supreme Court in North Carolina and won, amazing, love her, she's amazing. The state legislature passed a law, this is literally one of my favorite things in the entire book. They passed a law that Supreme Court candidates in the state, they would appear alphabetically on the ballot, starting with, wait for it, F. So that Anita Earls would actually be last on the list.
Wait, what does Earls start with?
I mean, it's just amazing.
Earls starts with an E? That's a total accident. I'm sure that's...
Start with F. Like, they'll be alphabetical, but starting with F. And I mean, that just goes to show, right? Like the Republican legislature there knew how important the state Supreme Court would be and turned out to be, right? With the litigation that's gone on in all kinds of areas. But couldn't agree more. State Supreme Courts, we gotta be focused on that.
It's all about skimming, right? It's all about taking a little piece away from everything you do. So
That's
if you know,
F, though, come on. I mean, did they really think no one would notice that? Like, it's the most obvious thing on the
but there's political science that shows that there's a 2 or 3% advantage or so to being, top on that line. So if you knock her down, and you've got the majorities to do it, you pick up 2 or 3%, right there. You knock a few voters away with a voter ID bill. You knock a few more away by purging them. You knock a few away by increasing the distance between their homes and the polls. You knock a few more away by taking away a day of early voting. And then in close elections, all of that skimming adds up.
Slowly but surely. This is the silliest anecdote, but I saw Anita like the week after the legislature made that move at a fundraiser, and she was telling me, she's like, this is what happened. And I was standing with the principal who I worked with at the time, and his response to her was, shut the F up. She looked at him and she's like, that's not funny. Which of course I was like, that's the best dad joke to ever tell, but she was not amused. And I was like, okay, well, humor and optimism not working in this case. But Dave, you just said this out of your, like you said, like added to the list of things that we're fighting for and that we're working on. So now if I'm keeping track of where we are, we've got secretaries of state, attorneys general, sorry, the dog is saying hello to me, state legislators, and now Supreme Court justices at the state level, which in some cases are elected, in some cases they aren't elected, and they're always nonpartisan for the most part races. So we've got that side of like the electoral things, but I'm thinking about how COVID has changed this election cycle in terms of voting. We keep talking about solutions being vote by mail, but like we've seen, and you talk about it in Unrigged, especially when we're talking about Native Americans, that vote by mail isn't a silver bullet, and it doesn't work specifically for communities that I like to say that they're the communities that we care about the most. Communities of color, elderly folks, young people. So if we're looking, if we're putting the elections of who we're electing over here, what are the things that we should be fighting for? What are the things that organizers on this call, because everyone on this call is an organizer, should figure out and call their local elected official and say, this is what we need to be fighting for, and this is what I need you to stand up for me with?
We need vote by mail that works, but we also need robust and vibrant in-person options for people. there are going, because the community, you said it exactly right. I can't say it any better than that. The communities that we're fighting for, um, mail doesn't always work. I mean, this is an extreme example, but I mean, in the book, I go to San Juan County in Utah, which is home of much of Navajo Nation. And San Juan County is the size of New Jersey. It's big, and it's majority Navajo, but there's a couple of white towns up in the northern top of the county, and they controlled politics there forever. And then the Navajo live the roads are washed out, and it's brutal. It's beautiful, but a brutal terrain. And in the Navajo part, you're talking about thousands of square miles. There are 3 post offices, and they're tucked into the back of gas stations. And you have to drive hours to get there. People maybe go once a month. And it's a long trek on roads that are washed out in a good rain. Vote by mail does not work in Navajo Nation. It does not work if you live in public housing and your mail is unreliable. It doesn't work if you're a young person and you move a lot and your address might not be exactly what it is when you registered at your parents' place to vote when you were 18. It doesn't work sometimes because of signature requirements. When the percentage of votes that get thrown out for not having a signature match, noticeably higher for young people and people of color. Young people don't sign their name with the exactness that an older person does these days, because when a young person's, young people aren't assigning checks, right? You're scribbling your name at the drugstore, the grocery store, when we went to drugstores and grocery stores.
Back in the before times.
So it's completely, so, and again, all of that is skimming, right? It's a little bit off the top. And so we need to be certain that there's vote by mail options and, that there's robust in-person options, drop-off centers. We can look at the states that do all of their elections by mail right now and what they do and have gotten right through hard-earned practice. And they send people ballots, and they have lots and lots of drop-off places open, and you can just be out walking around and you just drop it right in the box. You don't have to spend hours traveling to the one in-person precinct. That doesn't work. It's not working in primaries. I don't know why we think it's going to work in 4 months when turnout is 4 or 5 times greater. It's not enough. We should be sending everybody a ballot, making it really easy to drop it off. If you're going to have one in-person place, it had better be open for 2 or 3 weeks ahead of time. You have to have lots and lots of early voting. We need to be fighting for the Postal Service in this moment, right? I mean, if we're going to conduct a vote by mail election, and the mail service goes bankrupt in the middle of that, that seems like it would not be ideal. There are a lot of things like, we have to be thinking about voter registration drives. I mean, if you are turning 18 this summer, you might have registered to vote at a high school graduation or a fair or a football game. That stuff's not going to happen. Your town hall might not be open. Some states don't even do online registration. We need to be pushing for automatic voter registration, for online voter registration, for same-day voter registration, all of these things that are going to make it easier for people to register during a pandemic. I'm sure everybody else has got a lot of better ideas too, but there's a lot that We can do a lot. We have to do not a lot of time.
That's the scary part, is the not a lot of time part, and it gives me the butterflies. But I'm going to pivot a little bit, and I want to talk about something, Dave, that I know that is very near and dear to your heart, which is obviously redistricting and fighting gerrymandering. I mean, like, we could feel the passion come out, especially when you're talking about Michigan, when you're talking about Colorado, Missouri, Utah, and even in San Juan County, talking about the redistricting fight that happened at the county level. So 5 states last year changed the way, or not last year, 2018, changed the way in which redistricting will happen in their states. So I have a 2-part question. The first being, what can we do to support these new processes in commission states, states like Colorado, Michigan, but then also what can we be doing in non-commission states, which is the majority of states at this point still, both during this election year and then next year during accountability. So just would love to get your thoughts about those 2 pieces.
Michigan just, I believe they just began the process of announcing their new commissioners. So that's super exciting. So the application process and selection is underway for the independent commission in Michigan that was won by regular people. It started with Katie Fahey's Facebook post, and it turns into a revolution, and 430,000 people signing a petition, and 61% of the state in 2018 voting to establish this commission. It's one of the magnificent stories of our time. But it's not the only success story from 2018, of course, right? I mean, as you mentioned, you know, it's 4 other states. It's Ohio, it's Colorado, Missouri, and Utah, in which citizens overwhelmingly, except for Utah where it was close, but in the other states, you're talking about 60, 70% of folks. This means voters get it, right? When you put redistricting reform on the ballot in Missouri and it wins with almost 2/3 of the vote, that is not a red state. I'm sorry, that is not a blue state. When it wins in Utah, when it wins in Ohio at 70% of the vote, that means that regular citizens get this. They understand that gerrymandering is cheating. They value free and fair elections. The public is with us on this. The American people they understand it, and they don't like it. You're right, we are running out of initiative states. If you are watching us tonight and you're in Oregon, if you're in North Dakota, if you're in Arkansas, if you're in Nevada, there are drives underway to try and get independent redistricting on the ballot this year. It looks like Oklahoma is going to have to hit the pause button. You should be trying to sign those online signatures and get that underway. There's also a really, I think, amazing story about what we can do from Virginia. Virginia is not an initiative state. Virginia is going to have redistricting reform, essentially for 2 reasons. You know, I mean, one, because citizens demanded it, and they started an organization, and they put so much pressure on their legislators and brought so much to bear through letters to the editors and showing up and you know, fighting this battle and connecting it to our voice and policy. And 2, because people like Sister District flipped the legislature in Virginia, and that brought a change. And so the legislature there has now passed a language of a constitutional amendment. There's a little bit of work to do in special sessions over the summer to add the enabling legislation that will perfect it. It's a compromise. It's not perfect. And it will head to voters in the fall. No state legislature has ever voluntarily handed over this much power over redistricting before. So it's a sign of what citizens can do when they bring the energy on this issue, even if they don't have the initiative. As far as next year, super quickly, I mean, yeah, it's going to be really, really important. Um, tell your local newspapers you care about this. Insist that they cover it. Um, Try and insist that it be done in public. If the politicians are going to draw the lines, at least try and fight for transparency and try to get them on the record for why those lines are in those places. What you are doing in that case is you are building the record, a record that could be, especially handy when it comes to litigation. If Democrats are in the minority and Republicans have got complete control over the process in the state, build a really aggressive public record. That is something else that Virginia got right in 2011 when those maps were being drawn. And that record was what allowed lawyers who kept fighting to overturn those maps as a racial gerrymander. It took 8 years, right? I mean, it wasn't overturned until 2019. And when that racial gerrymander got overturned, and a fair map was put into place, and Sister District was unleashed, you all flipped the Virginia legislature and did amazing things on electoral reform, on healthcare expansion. This is what happens. But it started by playing a long game. It started by the public record that the Democratic minority built on these districts as they were being passed, that ended up becoming, key evidence that a federal court could not ignore.
Totally.
Yeah. The Thune Hill was what, a year ago last week. It was my first day at All on the Line, Gabby. Sorry. It was my first day. It was like such an auspicious moment where I was like, we're going to fix the things. And then the census case came out like a week later. And I was like, maybe we're not fixing all the things. But no, I think, Gabby, that's like what Dave was talking about is exactly right, which is that like with the electoral work that like Sister District and All on the Lines NDRC affiliate makes that huge difference. And then thinking about the long game, legislators in Virginia, the first bill that they passed this session after flipping the chambers was a Democracy Voting Rights Act, basically restoring reforms. I'm a Virginian, it benefits me. I'm not a Virginian by birth, but I live here now. But I mean, like expanding voting rights and thinking about that long game of like the minute we flip these seats, minute that we flip the chambers, turning that on. And that's the optimism that like we talk about with this book. So Gabby, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I know we're running out of time, so everything Dave said 1,000%. I mean, one thing I just do want to clarify for folks, the Virginia redistricting amendment is not without its controversies. And specifically, the Black Legislative Caucus has been very vocal in opposition to the amendment as it was passed. And so, I think it just shows that it's hard to get this stuff right. It's iterative. It takes time, and it's, there are imperfect steps along the way. But certainly, totally agree in general that Virginia is such a shining example of what building progressive power at the state level can mean for voting rights and for redistricting. It's it's fascinating. And thank you, Dave, for the shout out to what Sister District did. I mean, what we did on the electoral side really built on incredible movement work that has been going on in Virginia for a very long time. Want to give a shout out to Tram Wynn at New Virginia Majority and other folks who have been doing the movement work so that we could come in and help on the electoral side and really help get folks over the line. So absolutely agree with all of that. And just going back to wrap things up and return, Dave, to what you said about the optimism that shines through in this book, which is just a buoy in these times. I go back to the great American poet Patti Smith. The people have the power, right? And in the conclusion of your book, I love it. You end with this, note to your son. son, that the strongest, you know, piece of optimism you have is him. And that optimism really does shine through this book. And so I'd love to just hear, you know, and your kind of closing thoughts on that optimistic point. What do you bring out of the stories that you're telling in this book that we can all take with us and carry into our own volunteering and activism?
You know, this is a nation that has been built by people, it's been improved by the people, and it doesn't matter whether these are the women who are marching for suffrage, the marchers across the Pettus Bridge in Selma. Progress has been long, progress has been hard, but it's always been of our own making, right? There are no judicial superheroes, there are no perfect presidential candidates. It's us. And we have got the responsibility to fight for progress, brought together by the idea that change belongs to us all, that equal protection belongs to us all, that one person, one vote belongs to us all. What made change in 2018, it was citizens. It was citizens who had never joined a protest who took to the streets, who circulated petitions, who stepped forward to run for office, who launched new organizations or joined movements that tried to reimagine what democracy might mean. They imagined a different future. They ignored everyone who said the work would be too hard or scoring their efforts as irrelevant or warned that the odds of victory were way too uncertain for so much hard work and so much effort. And then they came together. They came together by the thousands. And they made those dreams real at the ballot box. They won resounding majorities of their fellow citizens. They inspired Americans in red states, in purple states, in blue states, who still believe in those words of the great American poet Patti Smith, that the people have the power, that all political power is inherent in the people, that all legitimate authority depends on the consent of the governed, that representative government must represent us all equally. And I very much believe that we can find energy and hope and faith and inspiration in the devotion of our fellow citizens, and that we can commit, all of us, to build that kind of nation in which every voice is heard and every voice carries the same weight. The battles that were won in 2018, they were led by Reclaim Idaho's folks in green RVs. They were won by millennials. They were won by former felons. They were won by suburban women. They were won by Americans of all ages and races who refused to believe that the act of creating change was beyond them. It's the proof, right? It's what all of us did together. I really do believe that there is a mighty unrigging that's underway. And I hope that some of this can leave you with the same sense of hope and optimism that it has for me. Building a democracy takes work. It's an active verb, right? I mean, people probably overquote Dr. King and the arc of the moral universe being long but bending towards justice. It don't bend towards justice by itself. It bends when all of us, every single one of us, put our hands on the arc, pull it in the right direction, and don't take our hands off of it, right? Vote up and down the ballot. Leave your hands on that arc and keep pulling it. Because there are folks who are trying to pull the other way. When you take your hands off, it's a tug of war. And it doesn't have to bend towards justice. We make that happen. We can and we will do it again.
Love it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Love it.
See, there was the optimism. There's the happy. That's exactly
there is optimism.
Yes.
I'm sorry sometimes we focus on these stories are partly cloudy, right? Or partly sunny. And sometimes we have to decide whether we're feeling partly cloudy or partly sunny. But the sun is coming.
Great.
1000%.
Well, thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Dave. Gabby, it's great to always be in partnership with you and with Sister District. We truly, truly value this partnership. And Dave, thank you so much again for joining us and for this conversation. So friends, this recording will be up on YouTube shortly. We'll be sending it around for folks to share with their friends. So we really thank you.
Thanks, everyone.